Welcome to another episode of Startup Health Now, the weekly show celebrating the healthcare transformers and change makers that are reimagining healthcare. My name is Stephen Krein, and on today's episode, I'm excited to be spending time with Julie Murchinson, the CEO of Health Evolution Summit, a longtime healthcare industry veteran, very connected on several fronts with the industry in so many interesting ways. I'm excited to spend time talking with her today. This is going to be a great episode.
It is the duty of leaders to lead, of the creative to create, of the daring to do. The free world expects leadership of us. Its fate and our fate depends upon our leadership. We are industrious, inventive, restless, with the fires that burn within us. But I say that nothing is easy, and the best things are the hardest. And all our troubles, all our immense difficulties, now and in the future, can I say, be solved if we have the will, the courage. The future is to those who take it.
Welcome back to Startup Health Now. I'm excited to be here with Julie Murchinson, the CEO of Health Evolution Summit. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's been an exciting year for you. I want to, both learn about Health Evolution Summit, but really, you've got you've got experience doing so many different things over the last several years. I want to kind of take a step back and get a sense of your background, because I think it's exciting both that Health Evolution Summit's now spun out of Health Evolution Partners, but I really think you've got a very unique view of the landscape of what's happening today. So I want to get some perspective on you. But before we do, a little bit about your background would be great.
Thank you. So I'm definitely a health IT junkie, was raised on that side, mostly in delivery, and a fair bit of management consulting, policy consulting, and a pretty good stint in a startup back in the day. So my perspective that I bring to things is really looking at getting beyond health IT and recognizing that there's so much about the system that technology alone can't necessarily fix. And I'm pretty focused personally as well as professionally on where those convergence areas are. So where does IT meet services, and how do you have to think about solutions there? Where are we now finally starting to see devices and diagnostics really take a look at what their business models are, that both are trending towards perhaps deeper service as well as leveraging technology and frankly becoming platforms of their own. So a lot of that is how I look at the world. Okay, so
take us back. What have you done over the last, let's call it 5 to 10 years, that has kind of shaped some of that perspective? Because I think you've done a number of things that almost have been, I think, practice for your new role as the CEO of Health Evolution Summit. So a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so the soft, fuzzy part of that is that I think I've been spending my entire career really trying to figure out how to make impact in healthcare. And I grew up on the institutional side. So I grew up inside of hospitals doing, operational reengineering and things like that. And one day I discovered our friends at Health 2.0 and thought, oh, wow, there's a whole world of innovators out there who are doing nothing but thinking about how healthcare could actually be delivered better. And, I started a nonprofit in that space looking at how we can help innovators really understand what's happening on the institutional side and understand the business models and the challenges that they have that don't just lend themselves to a very kind of logical, mostly technology solution. And in the midst of all of that, I was really focused on, how does philanthropy actually really help make change? Then I graduated, I like to say, to policy, and how can policy really help make change? And what I've actually really learned, this is the soft, fuzzy part, over the course of those years of working in policy in DC back in the stimulus ACA days and working with innovators, pretty hands-on, coming out of a career with the institutions, the commercial markets are the ones who make change. And we might have a lot of unintended consequences that the commercial markets get into, but it's innovators and scale partners who can really find each other and make massive disruption happen. So that's a lot of what I try to bring to certainly my role with HEP and now the summit, of how do we think about putting the big guys and the little guys, as I like to call it, together and helping to make those marriages and make some change.
And so that shaped your role at HEP. And so how long were you actually at HEP?
For 4 years.
Okay, and so in your role there was responsible for what aspect of what they do?
So really,
And explain what who HEP is
so
for those who don't know.
Health Evolution Partners, a middle market private equity firm. And a lot of our 100% healthcare focused, investing in growth companies and services, IT, and a little life science. And my role was really to focus on how we develop partnerships and relationships there that can help our portfolio companies. But we actually started the summit, or took it over from our friends at Burson Ventures and grew it as a way to really help get more visibility into the strategy across healthcare, as well as basically be able to have more impact that goes beyond being able to hold 8 or 10 portfolio companies at a time, right? So I worked with our investors on how we could help source better through those relationships with our portfolio companies, on some of them, how we could do some BD there. But mostly a lot of the focus has been on how that summit can actually really make some change that HEP may or may not be directly related to, but certainly is in the middle of understanding.
And then, so how did this summit evolve while you were there, at least taking it from where it was, 3 or 4 years ago till even last year's summit? What was some of the aspects of it that you think evolved it to the point at which it was now ready to spin out, and then we're going to dig into what you're doing with it, but how did it evolve?
So, we've spent a lot of time really focusing on the curation of who's there and how do you really understand who's doing what in the market and who is in the right place to be able to take advantage of, from CEOs and chairmen of venture and growth stage companies, which of them can actually take advantage of relationships with potential scale partners, plans, providers, pharma, et cetera. So the curation's been a huge piece of it. As part of that curation, we've actually really focused a lot on how we really keep it a very senior level, which I think makes conversations happen in a way that, whether for good or bad, is sort of the reality of how things can happen very differently.
So the conference and the content is only a piece of it. Obviously, the networking and who's in the room and who's outside on the terrace and who's kind of milling around having the conversations is obviously a key part of it.
Totally. And I would say that while we really think a lot and spend a tremendous amount of time on how to make the content work for the audience and how to really come up with the most compelling and roll up your sleeves sort of CEO to CEO discussions about what's happening in the market around a certain issue, it's all about the networking. And I think people come because it's 3 of the most efficient days you'll ever get in healthcare, and it's not just health IT or hospitals or devices. It's trying to be cross-sector.
So with the landscape filled with lots of different conferences and events that people can attend in this space, lots of really great events both throughout the U.S. and even global, how do you think of the Health Evolution Summit standing on its own, and how is it different than any of the other programs that people might choose to attend or be selected to attend?
So, I think the Health Evolution Summit is really focused on a place where deals can get done, and those deals can range anywhere from customer relationships, partnerships, acquisitions, other types of investment. And we look at that as being, the very senior leaders who can make those kinds of deals happen in very, very strategic ways. So I don't think the summit is a great replacement for anything else, frankly, because it's pretty unique both in its kind of industry as well as investor positioning, sort of where financial capital meets human capital, if you will. And I think, frankly, it can be a point of visibility for a lot of companies that are actually really getting a lot of traction that big guys want to know about and may not always hear about.
Fantastic. And so in the last year, just give us the news, because I think it's a pretty big move. So Health Evolution Summit spins out of Health Evolution Partners and is now a standalone, and you're the CEO. Tell us a little bit about that, and then I want to move over a little bit to all this incredible experience and how it translates into your view of where we are right now in this, I think, beginning of what's clearly a unique decade of transformation in the industry.
Yeah. Well, I think the summit is one of many places where executives can meet. What I think has made it unique is certainly the caliber and the cross-section, as I discussed. So what has been challenging at times is really thinking about HEP being in the middle of that, and HEP realized that, I think, very wisely. And we all decided that there's a lot more that the summit could do if it were a multi-investor platform. So HEP is very proud of founding it and is, excited to see it grow, but not necessarily by number. I think we've maxed out at our current location. But I think there's a lot more we can do by developing relationships with multiple investors who are really putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to healthcare and making a lot of, I think, very important companies grow and just even exist in the first place. And the summit will only benefit by, really trying to be much more versatile across that landscape.
So when you think about what you've seen and experienced, and you've been backstage at a private equity firm, a little later stage than I think a lot of the early stage discussions take place. And when you think about healthcare reform and you think about costs rising and the acceleration of aging and chronic disease, and you think about the living with now mobile devices and data now, or access to data that never existed before, and then you layer on this golden age of entrepreneurship, these macro conditions that I think are setting up a very different, let's call it next decade or so. From your perspective, what are the most, for you, what are the most visible data points or visible things that you're focused on as the landscape begins to change?
I think we're focused on, embedded in that question is kind of what is different enough that's actually worth supporting in many ways, right, or highlighting. And, I think there's a lot of people say this is like Groundhog Day, and it's just like the last time, right? And I sometimes feel that, and I sometimes wonder if we're really going to get anywhere.
Who do you think says that the most? Or what types of organizations, so we're not throwing anybody, what types of organizations or what kind of roles do you see in organizations where people are saying that?
I think certainly on the provider-payer side, we hear that a lot. Or people who are looking at providers and payers. It's people who are actually really pessimistic about ACOs. That's actually the number one place I feel like I hear it.
And they think it's Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
And so how are they approaching it? Because to them, it's Groundhog Day.
Yeah. I think some people are trying to figure out what ACO means to them and what risk-based care means to them and quality-based care and fee-for-value and all those things, and take it out of the hype context of that, three-letter acronym. And I think others are keeping multiple feet in multiple camps and really waiting it out to see how fast things are going to change, and not really, looking to innovate ahead of the market.
Right. So is it Groundhog Day in your mind?
I don't think it's quite Groundhog Day, no.
Not quite.
Not quite. I still think we have some market leaders, provider, payer, and pharma, who are really looking at very different models, whether it's providers who are looking at their branding, regional providers who are looking at how they brand in very unique and different ways to become national players, but not necessarily to become the next HCA or Tenet, right? We have health plans that are really engaging consumers in very different ways, or at least talking about how they're doing so. I don't think there's a model there that's necessarily the model for the future, but you're seeing some of that, but then you're seeing some plans that are sitting back, right? So same thing on pharma. I think you're starting to see some pharma companies pull out and make some pretty interesting strategic investments that potentially put them in a whole new role in the healthcare industry, and not just in drug discovery or drug marketing for that matter. And
so how do you think all of those incumbents and stakeholders are viewing this now growing, army of entrepreneurs that are reimagining every aspect of the industry and reimagining every part of, whether it's the experience in a hospital or the back-end infrastructure or data analytics that goes along with, the health plans? I mean, how do you think they're looking at the entrepreneurs with the disruptive ideas or the solutions that might not fit right into what they're doing so well, at least in terms of keeping their position?
Yeah. So it's a loaded question. I think there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of really trying to understand what's out there and what's going on. I think there's a tremendous amount of trepidation around the ability to work with any small company and actually take them to scale. So that question of how much critical mass does an entrepreneur need to actually be taken seriously by one of the large incumbents is, I think, still a very open question. And I think it's, some of the new whiz-bang technologies, for the most part, I think are really setting some back on their heels to figure out how they're actually going to deliver service differently in order to really use the whiz-bang thing, right? So what I think that where the disconnect I think one of the many disconnects can happen is the system hasn't quite thought through what it needs to be, what its business model will be. And it's doing so in parts, right? And it's doing so in very kind of specific therapeutic areas or what have you. So without more of a comprehensive view, it's sometimes hard to figure out how to pull in and adopt some of the entrepreneurial.
So do you see good examples of those organizations or people, because there's always people behind these organizations, people embracing the early stage innovations and entrepreneurs that are trying to improve the industry, improve the experiences, make people healthier, whatever aspect of it is?
I think you're seeing it in a lot of different places. First, I'd love to see more chief innovation officers. I think we're not seeing enough for the power of what that role has done for some systems. But you're seeing more dedication to, certainly on the provider side, the chief innovation officer, or even more significant strategy roles there.
And you look at that as a cultural embracing of how important innovation is to the strategy.
Yes.
Okay. And is it just sticking and being very direct here? Do you think it's just sticking someone from the organization in that role, or do you think it's actually, or do you see that those that perhaps are doing it well to be, maybe in from the outside, or had been in an entrepreneurial or a startup or a company that has been truly innovative before? I mean, how? Because I meet innovation officers all the time. Some are the real thing, and some are just they got put into that role, and they're no more innovative than the next guy.
So I think every company has that one person who could be that chief innovation officer, and I hate to use just that term, but I think part of that role is really understanding how to work within that organization and really tap into the right talents or the right personalities or understand the politics or whatever it is to accomplish their goals. But I think sometimes, just like those of us who've been in healthcare forever, don't always think of the most innovative ideas. I certainly think that's an issue in that role. And having someone who's more focused on innovation as a function go into that organization and apply that function to that organization, there's not necessarily enough of that happening.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There's also a disconnect sometimes when you've got someone in that role, but you have a CEO or leadership that doesn't actually empower that person to really, truly help bring innovation to the company.
So we had a session a couple years ago on chief innovation officers and their relationship with the CEO and the company, and whether they were actually there to be the skunk works office that was really focused on redefining the business models. But the CEO was sort of a little bit arm's length from that person, gave them plenty of elevation and respect, but wasn't arm in arm, right? And other innovation officers who were literally arm in arm with the CEO, executing the CEO's very bold new approach. And
so
strategy.
sitting very close to the CEO.
Yeah, and you're seeing all different models.
Yep, and so let's come back to so you use chief innovation officers. One, what else?
So I think corporate venturing is another area where the uptick, literally just in the last 12 months, has been quite something. And certainly we've seen it coming on the pharma side, and I think we've sort of seen it coming a little bit on the plan side as well. But now you're seeing providers who, even a couple years ago, I think the conversation with some of your entrepreneurs was around, whether providers are asking to take equity. And now I don't think providers are asking to take equity. Providers are starting to spell out the terms under which they'll work with you for equity and for, that relationship. So I think they're getting very savvy. And I think,
and that's actually a huge difference than even a few years ago when most corporate venture arms or corporate investing was done after the VCs get involved, after the equity, after it's been de-risked, and also more data has been accumulated to not only show that the business can work, so whether it's the revenue or the users or the adoption, but it seems like they almost came in after the venture capitalists got the equity value of those companies significantly higher.
Right.
Now you flip that around, and it used to be, by the way, stay away from the strategics until you're ready because of that.
Right.
We're seeing obviously the same shift, but I want to understand a little bit about what you think is different about them just entering and saying they're getting, are they culturally able to work with these startups and these companies, even though they're coming in early, are they able to work with them and do it well?
I think they're really striving to figure out how to work with them. And one important thing that I think is worth noting is I've talked to a number of folks who are in some of those groups who are really trying to understand how do you make those investments and actually really make them strategic and not just be the corporate money going in because you want to learn through the eyes of that entrepreneur or company, or you want to hope that in some later stage that company is going to be strategically beneficial to your company. So I've seen some of those groups that are trying to figure out, do we incubate ourselves to really make sure that there is a strategic tie, and what are the milestones that we know that is or is not going to work, and how do we deal with that? And I also am starting to see corporate venturing groups who are thinking about their own co-investment. Right? So you can very easily see how a plan and a pharma company or any combination could come together and both have interest in growing a particular analytics company or the like. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me to be a level of maturation in thinking that hasn't happened in the past.
All right, so we've got chief innovation officers, corporate venture. Anything else?
In terms of why things are feeling different?
I mean, I think, the notion of why some are able to successfully embrace working with early stage startups, I think, when I say early stage startup, companies that are being disruptive to and potentially bringing new solutions to the table that don't necessarily fit in, obviously, with the traditional methods of working with big companies. So the procurement through an agency or the procurement through a particular division in an organization, and kind of sidestepping that.
The only other thing I'll say, which I think is a little bit of it's not as direct as innovation officers or corporate venturing, but I think is worth noting, is the level of chatter in the industry around leadership. And having a really thoughtful, strong leader who understands the role of how to make sure you don't lose your shirt on your core business that may be waning, and how you innovate for the future. And then coupled with that is also a lot of the commentary in the industry around governance, and how governance is or is not doing its job in certain cases, because it's allowing, long-term CEOs to kind of continue down the same path and not demanding that there's actually more of a focus on where the future is and where the puck's headed. So it's an indicator, it's not a function.
So when you think about entrepreneurs and so a lot of this has been how the companies feel and what the companies need to do. Entrepreneur sits down, and whether they have industry experience or not, it's a daunting experience to kind of go through the long sales cycles, the regulatory environment, all these big obstacles. I know we try to make it easier by keeping a database of who's really helpful and leaning in and who's not, and being able to make sure that people don't waste their time.
Right.
What would you tell entrepreneurs, or what do you tell entrepreneurs today about how to successfully navigate through to not only get access, but achieve success with the partnerships with these large organizations? Because unlike every other industry where entrepreneurs don't really care who the incumbents are, they want to destroy them. They don't need to work with them. Yeah. This industry, probably a couple of them like this industry requires collaboration. And doesn't allow the entrepreneur to stand by themselves and not work with the providers or the plans or the government, in fact. What do you tell entrepreneurs today?
This is such a cliche, but do your homework is a big part of how this, I think, can play out. A big piece of the disconnect, I think, has been because there's sort of a refusal to understand what the current business models are sometimes on the side of an entrepreneur, and that might be harsh. But unless you're really looking at how they're currently making money and following that money and understanding how you disrupt that money, but actually why that can be beneficial to them, or make sure it's beneficial to them, that whole follow the money and understanding their business model is so critical.
Okay, so part one is when you do your homework, you're kind of focusing on make sure you understand how they're currently making money so you don't disrupt that piece, or at least if you do it, you're going to bridge the gap between what your solution is and what that is.
Right, exactly. So I think that's a big piece. I would say, too, is understand how they're experimenting or how they're innovating. So
or not,
I think,
or not.
Or not, right. Yeah, it's not only kind of who's your target within the organization, who might actually be your champion, right? That's, I guess, sort of a given. But I think different organizations are taking different approaches to playing with a lot of pilots for a long time. Or really, particular organization who I think has done nothing but, I shouldn't say that, but has done a lot of landscaping to really understand the market without necessarily applying a lot of innovations to
So who's dabbling or thinking about it versus doing?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So now you've done your homework and you now find out exactly how the companies are experimenting, and are they experimenting? If they are, how are they doing that? Which groups are doing it and who's doing it within the organization?
Right.
What else?
I think those are probably my two biggest, because I think the other comes down to timing, and that's not always a piece of advice that's actually easy to execute on, right? In terms of really understanding the timing of the overall market. But I think as an entrepreneur, that's a big piece of what you are trying to do. And I think that's actually got to be the most frustrating piece today, because the timing is not, I don't think, as accelerated as anybody would like it to be, nor is it seemingly consistent, right, across those folks.
And who are you inspired by in terms of organizations and maybe even collaborations with young early stage companies or startups? I mean, do you have, when you look through, obviously, the press releases and the press and the coverage of what's happening today, there's a lot of money flowing into startups. There's a lot of partnerships being created. There's large organizations buying. It's become very acquisitive. There's a lot of digital health companies now starting to get acquired, even though there's many of them are small. Are you seeing any inspiring partnerships or existing relationships that you think are great models that people should be looking at?
Such a great question. Without naming a lot of names, which you're asking me to do, I'll say that there are models like Cambia was a very early entrant into how plans are thinking about reshaping themselves and using corporate venturing as a mechanism. I think the jury's out on how that model will work for them as an organization, but I think they set the tone for how plans, certainly regional blues, really think about that. On the provider side, there's a lot of mixed models on the provider side right now. And it'd be very easy to kind of say, oh, the Mayos and the Cleveland Clinics and the da-da-da, but there's not necessarily one standout to me in terms of who's doing what. What I do like, though, is starting to see some of the provider collaborations that are providers working together to really try to identify
with each other.
And starting to really lay down some priorities that they can work on together, because they're not competing necessarily today. And they can actually carve out some spaces that they actually think are feasible to adopt, and may actually be able to accelerate adoption for the industry because they're working together. So I think those are some of the most inspiring. And not to get touchy-feely about it, because I don't think that they actually need to be working together as much as it's the importance of the priorities that they're setting, and actually really starting to define the spaces where progress can be made. And
so between payers, providers, pharma, and even the government, who do you think is being the most innovative today?
That is a tough question.
Just which category, not which names.
I think payers are. And I'm not sure payers have fully figured out what their model is at the end of the day.
Sure, but you think they're
experimenting the most.
You think they're experimenting the most. And we'll kind of wrap up with a framing of, if you were to sit down with an entrepreneur today and tell them how they should be thinking about, besides doing their homework and some of the more practical things, how they should be thinking about the amount of time and patience that it takes to kind of successfully collaborate with these large organizations, what would you tell them?
Time and patience. I would say, so partially it's what you're doing here, right? Really understanding, working with others to collect a lot of intelligence and to really understand how markets are moving. So being willing to really listen closely to not just those who you're talking to in your target market, but also how others are experiencing them. And I'm not necessarily saying being willing to pivot at any point that seems like pivot's the right thing to do, but being flexible to understand that your model might not be the exact square peg that's fitting in, and there may be some need for tweaking. I'd also say that I do think the market's moving slowly. So because of that, the question is, how do you actually get in there and kind of do a little bit more? And I think the flexibility, this is not easy to tell any entrepreneur who is trying to make money, right? But the flexibility to really try to figure out how to work with partners and end customers to demonstrate, and thinking about models that could work financially to do so, I think is really important, because there needs to be traction and recognition, certainly as you start to think about the clinical effectiveness of things or the efficiency outcomes that you can really produce or whatever it is. And unfortunately, we still function in that very kind of scientific data mode, when maybe we shouldn't always do that. Right. But we're still stuck in that. And
Yeah.
that's the reality.
Yeah, and that's I think the gap between the entrepreneurs who need to get validation for what they're doing versus just get the idea off the ground and begin to get some of that validation. So connecting some of those. So give us a preview of the Health Evolution Summit 2015. What are the big themes and what are you hoping to tackle?
Well, we're very pleased to have a new set of summit chairs and innovation chairs who are helping us think through the agenda. We're dedicating a piece of the agenda to earlier stage disruptive models. So just like I was saying before, trying to find those spaces where there is the best potential in the earlier stage and really help look at what's the investability, both from the institutional as well as the corporate venture, and what are the true issues for the end market that can really help pull through some of those companies with fantastic solutions. So that's one of the biggest things I think we're excited about,
Fantastic.
which is how do we get a little bit earlier and really help push us forward.
Fantastic. Well, Unity and I enjoyed attending last year and look forward to doing the same this next year. And I love the fact that you're opening up a conversation about the earlier stage, more disruptive stuff, because I think that when you marry that with some of the thinking around some of the things that are existing right now in the later stage and development, even past early stages, the developments that are happening there to open up everyone's eyes to both sides. I think one of the things as a long-term program we have is this notion that each stage is different, but yet having continuity through every stage is incredibly important. So excited to hear that. Well,
Great.
I really appreciate you spending the time with us today, and me today, but us. And look forward to seeing you at the summit, but also more importantly, I thank you for the work you're doing, because I think you're doing the important work that is needed to have the conversation between all the different stakeholders. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for all the work you and Unity are doing. I think we need more innovators who are putting the system to the test. And I think now our whole job for all of us is to figure out how to get it adopted.
Get it adopted. And we're going to end on that. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. You can always find all episodes at startuphealth.com/now. Thanks for joining us.